Italians started to make pasta, it was because it was like a dough. Again, since we don't use yeast in it, we don't have to wait for it to rise, but we should definitely wait for it to, rest, right? So again, this is both for all the culinary students, baking students. So it's handmade pasta. So what I have in here, you can see, is eggs, and I don't want them to fall out. So I'm just kind of whisking them, okay? Just whisking them, trying to break down that connective tissue. Right now, I could do this in the KitchenAid, I could do this in the RoboCoop, whatever you want to use, right? I want to show you how to do it with hand, because sometimes you don't have the option of using all of those things, right? So really simply, I'm just made a well in the dough, and I am just incorporating as much egg as I can in the flour. I'm just going to keep doing this, right? So the idea of pasta is that it should be a dough which has a stronger consistency. So you don't want the dough to be too soft, because otherwise when you pass it through the hand cranking machine, or even if it's something else, it's going to be too soft for us to use, really, right? So the idea is to use something which is a bit stronger, right? So I'm just going to use as much flour as I can in this, get it to the consistency. Now, of course, when you're doing this here, it's a totally different thing, but the consistency has to be tough, right? And the reason you want to leave it tough, you actually want to incorporate a lot of this flour in there, right? You don't want it to be soft, is because when you pass it through the machine, you don't want the pasta to crack, right? So a lot of times we avoid working on a harder dough because it's easier to work with a softer dough, and I get that, I get that, but in this case, you want a hard dough, right? So you want to, and now you've all learned this, that when you were doing bread and when you were doing other things, that you've learned this, where you want to incorporate now the flour in there, right? So how do you do that, right? Which is very simple. So you hold it with one hand on this side, right? And then you are just using the base of your palm right here to incorporate this dough, right? So if you can see this, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to incorporate as much dough, as much flour as I can in my dough without, it being too much. So this seems like a pretty good consistency, okay? I'm going to go and excuse myself. I'm going to get a bench scraper and get rid of the rest of the flour, right? So this is a really good consistency, So what is the consistency about, right? So if you see this dough is still soft but gets hard. I'll probably incorporate just a little more flour. Let me tell you why. Because when it sits down, it's going to rest and it'll become softer. So you want it a bit tight. You want the dough to be a bit tight, just so you can work easily on it. So you can see this is just starting to form. Now, me stretching this out like this actually activates the gluten in the flour. So how much flour did I use? As I said earlier, I used 3 cups of flour. I used 4 eggs. And in my case, I use a little more just because I know the consistency as to what I do, so I don't really need to measure it out, but and I will put a recipe as well in a Word document and attach it to the discussion post. So that's your flour, right? People have their own ways of doing it. Some people will add olive oil, some people will add salt, pepper, which I have. It was already in the flour. Now I just put some oil on this because I don't want it to form cracks, right? So now that this is ready, I'm going to put it on this side. I'm going to get another egg, just going to get another egg because I have that flour out here, and I can make some more pasta, so just so that it's easier. So same thing, think something like this, maybe even one egg is plenty. We'll see if we need another one. Again, once you know what dough feels like, which is, again, it's a thick dough, it's a hard dough, you're like, okay, you can easily manipulate the dough. Understanding dough is about really using your hands, feeling the dough, and you can try this at home. You all have professional cookery, and it has a pasta recipe, and that recipe works very well. So this one is here. Now what I'm going to do is here, and that's it. So I have all this flour, and I think, judging by the look, if I add one more egg, I can get some more pasta. I originally wanted to do just one portion of it, but at this point, I just do 2 portions, and so there we go. This is perfect. So just incorporating that flour in there, just using that. Now, you can use some water in it. I advise you not to. I'd rather use the egg so I can get that flavor. I can get that richness from the egg. As you know, the egg yolk is all fat. So it's 3 grams of fat in the egg yolk. So I'd rather use just eggs. I like to use eggs. You can use, as I said, you can use water. I prefer not to. It's just my personal preference. Because then water makes you lazy. You're like, oh, maybe I'll just do it like this and it'll be fine, but not really. No. So we have this dough sitting out here. All this will become one dough. So if I look out here, I have some more eggs in here. So let's try and incorporate as much flour as we can, right? Now, it's hard work. Working with pasta dough, it's hard work because you want that consistency, you want that tightness, but it'll get incorporated. As you can see, it's getting there, it's getting used. So, as much as personally I love working with doughs, not bakery wise, but definitely cooking wise. Doughs is therapeutic. It's like working with clay. People who work with clay, it's therapy. So if you can use dough and you can understand how dough works, you can practically make anything. Pizza doughs, bread doughs, croissants. That's all. So as you can see, I've used all of that flour that was sitting there, right? And I'm just going to keep incorporating it. And it's a hard dough to work with, So again, the idea is the same. Use your wrist to break it in, So I think you can see it better now, because initially the flour was so white, you really couldn't see where the flour is and where everything else is. But now you can see, okay, so I'm going to bring this here, because you don't want to waste. That's the other thing, we have to understand it takes a lot for a farmer to grow something. Some of you are farmers, some of you have farms. You know what it means to grow something from the ground, and it's a lot. It's a lot of hard work. So respecting that ingredient is one of the biggest things. You want to use as much of that ingredient as possible, get as much of a yield, not just for the food cost. Yes, for the food cost because it's monetary, but ethically, you should use as much of that ingredient. When you get into, if you talk to chefs who are in tune with what's happening around us, we look at sustainability and how important it is. It's very important that we, use everything. So this is going to sit for a while, okay? And I'm just going to let it sit, let it rest. I'm going to get the bench scraper, and I'm going to clean clean the board. Now, if you look at my hands, I've used all the flour that was in there, right? I would never advise anyone using gloves to make pasta, okay? A couple of reasons for that. It's gonna cook in boiling water, right? Which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It's way above your danger zone. So 165 is your danger zone, really. So once you go above 165, it's safe to consume it. Depending on what you're making, of course, But 212 is phenomenal to cook something. So there is no, bacteria that's growing in there at that time. Now, after you've boiled the pasta, you have to be careful that you use tongs, and that if you're going to mix it, if you're going to add Parmesan cheese, that's when you need to make sure you're wearing gloves and everything is coming along fine. So let me go ahead and get the bench scraper, clean this up, and then we'll let it rest for 5 minutes. 5, maybe 10, just depending on how long it takes. So, let's just let it rest. I'm going to put in some oil as well. I'm going to incorporate some oil. And the oil will make it a bit more moist, but not in the sense that it softens the dough. It kind of gives it a richness. Of course, since it's Italian cooking, we are going to use olive oil in this, so the flavor comes out strong, right? So I'm just going to rest. I'm going to let it rest. Now, it doesn't have to rise. There is no yeast in this dough, so the yeast doesn't have to activate. I'm not letting it rest so the yeast can grow. I'm letting it rest because the gluten has all come together in one spot. So if at this point I try to roll out the dough, it'll stretch and it'll come back. That's why you rest dough, so that the gluten can go back, the molecules can go back in their own areas, and now you have a dough that's resting. So when you work with it, even though it's a tight dough, it's easier to manipulate, okay? I'll be back in a minute. Just want to see how it's coming along. So yeah, so now I'm cleaning my area. So as much as making pasta